Hello, my name's Roisin and I'm sick of reading. Hello friends! So I made a video a few months ago about my top 10 historical fiction recommendations, and it is now the most viewed video on my channel. So I thought that showed that clearly you want historical fiction recommendations. Everyone is hungry for some history. So I thought that I would give you 10 more historical fiction recommendations. Some of these didn't make my first list because I hadn't read them yet. Some of them I forgot about, but that doesn't mean they're not as good as my top 10 historical fiction recommendations. I will leave in the cards above my original top 10 historical fiction recommendations as well as my Wolf Hall review, because everybody needs to read Wolf Hall. You have to read Wolf Hall. If you haven't read Wolf Hall yet, leave this video and go and read Wolf Hall now. Okay? Please remember to like this video if you liked it and subscribe for more book recommendations and reviews. So the first one on my second list of top 10 historical fiction recommendations is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Now I know this was made into a TV adaptation with, I believe, Eddie Redmayne and Clemence Posey, but I never saw it, so I can't recommend that. I don't know how good it is, but the book is excellent. Birdsong follows the life of the Englishman Stephen Raisford, who lives in France in 1910. It follows his life through living in France and having a love affair with a married French woman through what happens in the First World War. It also flashes back and forwards between his granddaughter in the 1970s, who is discovering things about his life, and then back into what happened to him during the war, where he was a tunneler who helped to tunnel under the trenches in order to get to the enemy trenches and try and blow them up. So he spent a lot of life underground in a small tunnel, not knowing if he was about to be blown up himself. It is incredibly beautifully written. It is quite poetic prose, but in a very sparse way, which I think really works with the setting of World War One. I had a massive World War One binge where I read mostly World War One fiction about 10 years ago, and this was one of the books that I read then, but I do remember how beautifully poetic the language is, and also how well it deals with trauma. A lot of the conception of war in public understanding, especially of the First and Second World Wars, is very romantic and glorified, but the true tragedy and the visceral disgusting things that happen, not just people being blown up, but also like trench foot, but also the toll that it takes on someone's psyche. All of these are really beautifully explored in this novel. They saw the Scots coming up out of their burrows like raving women in their skirts, dying in ripples across the yellowish-brown soil. They saw the steady tread of the Hampshires as though they had willingly embarked on a slow-motion dance from which they were content not to return. They saw men from every corner walking, powerless, into an engulfing storm. The next one on my list is Golden Hill by Frances Spufford, which I read at the end of last year, so just before I started making videos. I think I talked about this in my favourite books of 2019 video. This is set in New York in 1746, so a generation before the American Civil War, when New York was a town of 10,000 people compared to the 1 million people in London at the time. It was a very small town. And a handsome stranger fresh off the boat arrives in New York with a promissory note for £1,000, and the merchants of the town don't know whether or not to fill this note. He won't explain how he got the note or where he comes from or what he is planning to do with it, and he gets into all sorts of interesting scrapes. What I love about this novel is that it really embeds you in the 18th century through the use of language. The descriptions and the internal monologue of the main character are all told in an 18th century way. It is also in the style of an 18th century novel where things happen out of the blue. It is a very funny comedic novel, but it also deals with issues of slavery, of racism, of classism, of sexism, of the position of women, and it has some of the most brilliant characters. The woman with whom the main character falls in love, and her spikiness, her bitterness, her self-destructiveness, all of it. I really enjoyed this novel, and the twist at the end is definitely one worth reading for. Me? Never in my life, said Smith, giving them his familiar beam of amiability. Only now with a ragged carelessness, a desultory approximation, like a man who briefly raises a mask on a stick to his face but cannot be bothered to line up the eye holes. Septimus and Hendrik glanced at each other involuntarily. to share the dismay that each for different reasons was feeling. Next I want to talk about The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste, which is a book I read this year in February and about which I have a reading blog. This is one of the best books that I have read so far this year, and it is set in Ethiopia in 1936 on the eve of the Italian invasion. The main character is named Hirut, and she is recently orphaned and moved into the house of Asta and Kidane as a maid, where she suffers brutally at the hands of both of them. The wife Asta through violence and the husband through his advances, which she refuses. Kidane is an officer in the army, and he's trying to get his men together in order to combat the invading Italian army, but Mussolini's army is more technologically advanced and much bigger, and so Haile Selassie the emperor leaves and the Ethiopians lose morale, so Hirut dresses up a peasant boy as the emperor in order to aid their guerrilla warfare. Mengiste has talked about how the women fought during this invasion but are often left out of the songs and stories, and so she wanted to bring them back into it. There is an epigraph from Homer at the very beginning of the Iliad, and there is bits throughout from the women in the style of a Greek chorus, so we feel that sense of epicness, of heroism, of whose story gets to be a hero. There is a lot of violence and sexual violence in this, and I love that the nuance of that is explored. The nuance of, yes, we have the colonial invading army and the terrible, brutal things they do to people who they don't see as human as them, but then we also see the violence between genders and classes within Ethiopian society. And I think that it is really well explored. She has grown so numb that it no longer matters whether he might strike her or not. She does not care if he takes out his camera to push it in her face. She is not afraid of him anymore. Another book I read last year is Secret River by Kate Grenville, which is, I think, an Australian classic, but one that I had not read before. It is set in 1806 about William Thornhill, who is an English bargeman of quick temper but deep compassion. He is a warm-hearted man who has fallen on hard times, and he ends up trying to steal some wood. And as his punishment for the crime, he is sent to 7 years penal servitude in New South Wales. Falls in love with this country, and he strives to make a home there for himself and his wife and his children, but in order to make that home he has to steal the land from the people who have been there for thousands of years. This novel is incredibly beautifully written and atmospheric. I love how slow it is and how that slowness makes you feel the strangeness of the surroundings for the people from England who have moved to Australia. The beauty of it, the writing is like a love letter to the Australian outback, but also the way that it deals with colonialism and the abuses and the violence of colonialism, how people who had dealt with brutality in their own life can then enact that on people that they see as so entirely other from themselves. Powerful psychological examination, and one that is incredibly beautifully written. This place had been here long before him. It would go on sighing and breathing and being itself after he had gone, the land lapping on and on, watching, waiting, getting on with its own life. Next one is one that I know is incredibly popular, but I did love it myself and I didn't feel like I could leave it out this time, and that is The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This is a story set in Nazi Germany beginning in 1939, told from the perspective of death, and it is about a little girl who finds a book at a graveyard and ends up stealing books. She steals books from book burnings and from the mayor's library, and her father, her new adopted father, teaches her to read, but their new family's life is threatened when they take in a Jewish man and hide him in their basement. I loved the way it was written. I had never read a novel that experimental when I first read it. It was definitely a new experience for me. I think I read it when I was quite young. I was 12 or 13, and I feel like I should probably read it again as an adult, but that was a new experience for me and one that I greatly enjoyed. I also really enjoyed the relationships between the people, between Liesl and her new father, between her and between the Jewish man that they rescue, and between her and Rudy, the boy with whom she develops an intense relationship. I thought that it was powerfully done and very, very moving. People observe the colours of the day only at its beginning and ends. But to me it's quite clear that a day merges through a multitude of shades and intonations with each passing moment. A single hour can consist of thousands of different colours. Waxy yellows, cold spot blues, murky darkness. In my line of work, I make a point to notice them. Number 6 on my list is one I read for my A-levels about 10 years ago, and that is The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is set in 1969 in Kerala, at the very tip of India. It is about twins, Rahel and Estepen, and how they fashion a childhood from themselves out of difficult circumstances. Their lonely, lovely mother, their blind grandmother, their beloved uncle, and their enemy. But when their English cousin comes to stay, they realise that life can change in an instant. This is another novel where the setting is so lovingly portrayed, and also the relationships between these people are so compelling. It is a very close family book, and it is also a novel about the caste system and about sexism in India and more generally, and it is about the ways that people can hurt people because of misunderstandings. It is a powerfully moving novel, and one which really made me feel like I needed to visit Kerala because of the way it so beautifully describes the landscape. It is, after all, so easy to shatter a story, to break a chain of thought, to ruin a fragment of a dream being carried around carefully like a piece of porcelain, to let it be, to travel with it as Velutha did, is the much harder thing to do. Next, I would like to recommend How We Disappeared by Jing Lee, which I read for the Books for the Brave charity readathon this year, which I will link in the cards above. And this novel is set in Singapore in 1942, on the eve of the Japanese invasion. It flashes back and forward between that time period and the year 2000, when the main character, Ngozie, has lost her husband. It also has the perspective of a young boy named Kevin, who is living in Singapore at the same time. In 1942, when the Japanese invade, the 17-year-old Ngozie is kidnapped and taken to the military rape camps to be what was known as a comfort woman. We discover that she has never talked about her experience to anyone. It takes Kevin to hear a garbled confession from his grandmother on her deathbed in order for the whole series of events to unravel. This is a harrowing, difficult read, but it is also incredibly beautifully written, and the characters of the women who have been taken to these rape camps, they are so resilient and beautiful and tragic. Their experience is truly horrific, but one that I think needs to be known more about, and this novel is a beautiful and heart-wrenching way to learn to understand that. Next, I am not sure this can entirely count as historical fiction, but it is one of my favourite books, and it is set in a period before it was written, so it is historical therefore. For that reason, it is Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, which is a semi-autobiographical novel. The story of Jeanette, who in the early 1970s is growing up in the north of England, and she has been adopted by a highly Christian evangelical woman, and she is part of that church, but she also falls in love with one of the congregation who is a woman, and it is about her experience of abuse and about her experience of growing up in that time period, in that area and in that specific community, about her discovering her sexuality and discovering what that means for her relationship with the church. It is a sort of slightly fabulous novel with magical elements, and it is very tender and very, very funny. It has a very dry, witty, sarcastic sense of humour, and also it is a bit surreal and bizarre and out there, which can also be funny as well. I love the voice with which this is written. I also listened to the audiobook, which is read by Jeanette Winterson herself, which I think makes a great deal of difference. There are many forms of love and affection. Some people can spend their whole lives together without knowing each other's names. Naming is a difficult and time-consuming process. It concerns essences, and it means power. But on the wild nights, who can call you home? Only the one who knows your name. Number 9 on my list is How to Be Both by Ali Smith. Now, this novel is split into 2 parts, one of which is set in modern day and one of which is set in the Renaissance. So we've got George and Francisco, and you've got their stories. And this was actually published 2 different ways. One has George's story first and one has Francisco's story first. So it can be read either way. I read it with George's story first, which is the modern time period, but it was also set in the 16th century, and that was actually my favourite part of it. I preferred that part, possibly because of how much I love historical fiction. And it is a story about love and about discovering your sexuality and discovering who you are, and I thought that it was so beautifully written. It's a very strange experimental novel with slightly magical elements as well. I know how much a lot of people love Ali Smith, and this is the only one I've read of hers, but I did love it. I thought that the characters were vibrant and alive and interesting, and I loved the way that they thought and the way that we experienced their thoughts, because it felt very real to the way that people think, and it didn't feel fictitious in any way. It felt very organic. I also thought that the explorations of gender were really well done, and that it was a very pared back but beautiful novel. Want is quite a complicated word there, because there's volo, which means I want, but it's not usually used with people. Desidero, I feel the want of, I desire. Amabo, I will love? But what if I will never love? What if I will never desire? What if I will never want? Namkwam Amabo. Another book I read last year is Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozie Adiche. This is one of Chimamanda Ngozie Adiche is a writer that I love, and Americana is my favourite book of hers. This is her historical novel set in Nigeria of the 1960s during the Biafran War. It is about Olana and Agwo and Richard. Olana is a beautiful Igbo woman who is in love with a professor who she is not married to and her parents want to marry her off to someone else. Agwo is the houseboy in Olana's household, and Richard is in love with Olana's sister, and he is an Englishman living in Nigeria, and it is about what happens to them during the Biafran War. It is a story about found family and love. It is a story about class, and it is a story about revolution and war and colonialism. It is powerful, it is dramatic, it's definitely a lot of melodrama, there is cheating and there is a lot of passion and humanity in this novel. It is a novel about human lives in the midst of such a difficult situation such as the Biafran War, and it definitely educated me about that situation because I didn't know that much about it. It starts off with so much domesticity, and the difficulties in their life are surrounding that domesticity, and the politics are in the background. We hear about what's happening, but it is not directly affecting anyone's lives, and then throughout the novel the politics comes closer and closer and the domesticity fades away. It is a novel about what happens to women in war, what happens to children in war, child soldiers, and also the horrible remnants of colonialism. So that is it. That is my 10 more historical fiction recommendations. I hope you found a book there that you are interested in. Please let me know in the comments, what is your favourite historical fiction book that you have ever read? I'm always looking for more to add to my TBR. Please remember to like this video if you liked it, and to subscribe because I put out new videos every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday. Thank you for watching. Bye bye!